Hello and welcome to another video for ENT210 creativity. I just wanted to recap on a few things and sort of try and pull together some of the various ideas that you have been reading and watching. Firstly, I've separated, for the sense of convenience, the influences on creativity into three broad areas. We discussed this previously, but first, environmental impact on our tendencies to be creative or not. The physiology surrounding it, which is pretty slim but shouldn't be ignored. And the psychological or personality factors. Those are very, very important to this study. So I'll go through them very briefly in that order. Within this, there are factors such as nationality. We talked about in an earlier video individualism versus collectivism. And this really goes back to the group affiliation model of creativity. In the sense that we have on the one side our need to be individual and to be seen to be individuals. We don't like being bundled into one of a huge group. On the other hand, we have our need for human connectivity, our group affiliation, if you like. And these two factors are in opposition. So if you guide somebody towards one end of the process, I mentioned this in a previous video. For instance, if you subject somebody to a threat such as a terrorist attack, then they will tend to go towards the group. This is a pretty natural thing, isn't it? If you can imagine, wind the clock back to the point where your principal means of defending yourself were your fists and your spear. If you've got a wild animal attacking your tribe, then that is going to be a very strong incentive for you to kind of connect together. Perhaps another tribe is attacking your tribe. So, that's the very time when you're going to be working together. So once again, kind of any threat will tend to pull us towards the group. So that's on the one side. And when that happens, as discussed previously, we tend to be less creative because creativity requires us to be thinking as individuals, not as group members. And creativity, of course, as we talked about before and to discuss a little bit more later on, also requires a certain freedom from the pressures of stress. So once again, if we're sort of in the middle of being attacked by another tribe, we're not going to be at our most creative. We're going to be tending to seize and freeze. But I'm moving ahead of myself here. So individualism versus collectivism is an influence on our creativity, and most of the quantum leap kinds of creations, innovations have really come from the more individualist countries. During the Industrial Revolution, phenomenal levels of innovation came from Great Britain in terms of things like the steam engine and the Bessemer converter to make high quality steel. We've got all sorts of different things, the railroads, we've got machines to pump water and to run the cotton mills and all that kind of stuff. That all came out of Great Britain, which was a highly individualist country. Many other of our more contemporary, particularly, innovations have come out of America. All the kind of things that power computers worldwide, from the work of Bill Gates and his crew to Apple to all sorts of different things. They have tended to come out of the United States, and these really are quantum level innovations, aren't they? Other factors then. So we've talked a little bit about threat, the tendency to seize on an idea and freeze the search for any other ideas. These are environmental factors. and the tendency for stress also to reduce our enthusiasm for looking around for new ways of doing things. And generally speaking, anything that will tend to make us focus on some particular aspect of our work that will prevent us from being creative. So threat, stress, tendency to worry, these kinds of things are not, generally speaking, conducive to creativity. Although, as also noted, sometimes in times of war, there is a great deal of motivation for innovation. So you have things like the radar and the jet engine and the splitting of the atom. These were all, just incredibly important innovations. Sometimes, of course, used for rather negative purposes, but also having positive implications. So motivation can be caused by stress, and there is a very interesting set of studies that I conducted which showed some new light on this, in the sense that when people are put under stress, if they are also given a mechanism of motivating themselves to mitigate that stress, then actually stress can be positive to creativity. In other words, you imagine that you're working for a company that's sort of teetering on the edge of going bust, and they've got one more chance to really kind of perhaps dig themselves out of a hole. Perhaps this is a music production company, and they're about to put on what might be their last musical production, concert, whatever. If that concert is a great success, then they might live to produce something another day. On the other hand, if that's not a success, they will go under. So in those kinds of circumstances, provided the right people know that that's the situation, you can find stress will enhance creativity. On the other hand, if you just have people in a stressful environment and they have not got the knowledge of or the specific way to dig themselves out of that hole, then stress will tend to undermine creativity. So, this is very early days for this kind of study, but it was an interesting result. A very, very strong influence that I talk about to the point of ad nauseum, really. Social norms. These are the unwritten laws that keep us doing the things that we do. They impact our behavior in such a way that we have a tendency to try and do things in a way that will be approved of within our social setting, and similarly avoid things that would be disapproved of. Now, not everybody does that. You have all sorts of kind of mental illnesses. Psychopaths, for instance, do not particularly share that tendency to want to do things in the way that society does. And to some extent, you might say that of anarchists, although that is really a second cousin to creativity, in the sense of doing things that are essentially new and different. And new and different, of course, means you're not slotting into the normal social practice. So there's a grey area there between to what extent anarchy is positive or negative. It depends on the context, it depends on the goals, of course. But social norms are very, very important things that influence what we do, and they influence how creative we wish to be. Phrases like, it's just not your place to do that, it's not okay to fail. Failure is a part of trying things that are new. And you have two different ways of dealing with failure, don't you? One is a learning experience, and the other is you wander off with your tail between your legs and don't try it again. So this is another important factor. At the time when I was growing up, there was no shortage of sort of places, environments, social environments in which people were being brought up and went to school. And they were, for instance, I have friends who were dissuaded from the thoughts of any kind of further education because their place was to be a bus driver or a shorthand typist or whatever. So in other words, the social norm was against them trying to break out from the social class in which they currently were. Obviously, that kind of environment can be very difficult to fight and maybe just a dissuading factor in terms of creativity. And within an organizational context, I think we've probably all heard some phrase that has the same meaning as "we've always done it this way." So this is all part of the social influence on our tendencies to be creative. Environments also can be either supportive or they can be oppressive. There's no shortage of politically oppressive environments currently in the world and that have existed over the past half century. Before the Berlin Wall came down, there was a great deal of oppression in what was then the Soviet Union. Now that political oppression can also, I sort of think of that as a sort of bubbling mass of magma below the surface, and if the pressure gets too great, it might explode into a volcano of creativity. So you have some very well-known writers, cartoonists, painters who came out of the Soviet Union who were creative despite the political oppression. In other words, the political oppression motivated them to take certain actions against that regime. However, that tends to be the extreme. In a more sort of general level, at a grassroots level, it's much more difficult for people to feel motivated to be creative when the environment is oppressive. Now that's an extreme example of oppression, but a much less extreme example of oppression can exist in almost every business that you can walk into, in the sense that you're really expected to do a certain job and to do it a certain way, and really a lot of times managers or supervisors will tend to think that somebody saying, "I think I could do this better," is likely to increase the workload or the stress load for the supervisor. So the tendency will be, well, actually it all works fine right now, so why don't you just carry on doing what you're doing? And that leads us really on to poor leadership. Businesses can be led in such a way as they encourage high degrees of creativity. Companies like 3M, Microsoft, Apple, the Virgin Group, Branson's Group, they actively support creativity. Their leadership is designed to do that, and leaders or potential leaders that do not show those tendencies will often not go very far in those organizations, because they recognize the importance of creativity, and they also recognize that there are many factors, including leadership, which will tend to sponsor or undermine creativity. And really, as well as political oppression, you've also got sort of social oppression. If you could imagine yourself sort of in let's say, a mining community, or a community where there is a tight social network in place, that is not likely to be supportive of creativity. So that kind of thing can also be undermine our tendency to be creative. There are other factors that are both personality and environmental factors, such as education. You can't really display creativity without some degree of skill. A painter needs, if they're going to be creative, or if they're not going to be creative, they need a certain skill. They need to be able to display their creativity. And if they can't paint, then they can have all sorts of exciting creative ideas, but they've got no way of expressing that. Similarly, in the musical arena, if you wish to compose in a different way, that requires you to be able to compose at all. And similarly, if you look into the areas of, say, technology, where we think perhaps of innovation, that might be the first arena in which comes to mind when we talk about innovation. These days, if you want to innovate in a technological arena, you need to have some knowledge of things like perhaps maybe some element of electronics, maybe you need to have some knowledge of the limitations of perhaps plastics or whatever it is. But you're unlikely to sort of pop up out of a vacuum and innovate in those kinds of areas without having the appropriate skill set. If you look into sort of totally different areas such as finance, I mean, one of the conclusions that came out of the 2008 collapse due to the mishandling of the mortgage environment and various other corruptions that went on in the financial arena. One of the things you might conclude is that there were too many untested, untried, misunderstood products that were being offered in the mortgage market, and that was a function of creativity. These things were creative. Creative things don't always have positive end results. So, to some extent, we have a need for educational factors, skills, when we're looking to be creative. I talked very briefly previously about physiology, but there aren't too many physiological factors that people have really identified. In other words, there's not too much going on in the brain that differs from one person to another that either enhances or undermines creativity. I mentioned the corpus callosum that joins the two hemispheres of the brain. There are various assumptions associated with that. I happen to believe, and I'm currently working in an area of research to do with whether both hemispheres of the brain are necessary to be creative, and if communication between those two hemispheres is better, then it's more likely to enhance creativity. And the answer is we simply don't know yet. There's a field of study that involves fMRI, functional MRI of the brain, which looks at which areas of the brain are doing what when we're thinking about certain things or whatever. So if we're thinking about creativity and innovation, we can see various areas of the brain light up. And that's pretty interesting stuff, but still a long way to go before we can really conclude anything much about that. There's certainly true to say that certain forms of damage to various areas of the brain can suddenly unleash creativity in people. People that really never showed any signs of creativity before, suddenly in an accident, certain parts of the brain are damaged, and a few weeks later they are painting things that they could never have anticipated painting. Now, whether or not something sort of strange has been unleashed in terms of the memory, or whether something has actually some previous self-imposed limitation has somehow disappeared because of the accident. So in other words, all these potential things were bubbling away there, but some self-imposed limitation just kept the lid on that, and that lid was finally kind of released, and the person was able to be creative. So anyway, the physiology of the brain really is a very unknown field in terms of its impact on creativity. Other factors, the last category really, which is the psychological or personality factors that influence creativity. Procrastination, our tendency to procrastination, and its opposite, precrastination. In other words, we want to get things done as soon as they're put on our desk, or we leave them to one side and do them a bit later. And as I mentioned previously, one of the implications here is that actually doing it sort of immediately is not the most creative time to do it, and if you leave it to the last minute, that's not most creative time to do it either. But there will be a video later on which goes into that in greater depth. Positive mood is linked to high degrees of creativity. We don't know whether being happy will make you feel more creative, or whether you are being creative and that makes you happy. We don't know, but the two are linked together. Your tendency towards group membership, if you like to be in groups of people, which ironically enough, of course, will sort of tend to make you happy, but that group membership will tend to suppress your desire to be individual. Some people can't bear to be in their own company, and to some extent they are self-limiting their creativity. Divergent thinking ability is really equivalent to being creative, but it itself requires all sorts of different things that will make it a possibility to think divergently. In other words, thinking divergently is all about connecting ideas that were not previously connected. So taking ideas from this domain and adding them to your solution, prospect of solution in another domain. Now that's all very well, but of course that means you have to have knowledge in this other domain. So to some extent this also ties in with the whole issue of skills, in the sense that having knowledge in one domain requires some degree of skill, if you like, in that domain, or education in that field, and being able to sort of move that across to another domain requires a sort of broad sense of skill. So, what this might be implying is that people who are educated in a very broad range of things may in fact have they may have a start, a kickstart in terms of the potential to be creative. Doesn't necessarily mean that's going to come to fruition. Lastly, the other thing which is important really is tenacity or motivation. If you're trying something new and you stop at the first hurdle, then you're not really going to get a very successful result at the end of it. So being a bit tenacious and having the motivation to actually see something through to its end is critically important. When I was inventing the microphone that came to be used by sort of Frank Sinatra and Radio City Music Hall and the Moody Blues, and anyway, 150 sort of very well-known musical environments and musicians. One of the things that took about 2 years to develop, and it was all a question of using the right materials and the right spacing between materials and all sorts of different technological issues. So the actual development of the idea behind it was a very swift process. I needed a microphone that was unique in many different ways. This thing looks like a little black sort of piece of black plastic belt, and it sticks on the instrument underneath the piano or whatever. But it had to be technologically different. It had to work on a totally different principle than anything that went before it. So there were no starting points with this. It was an idea and how you develop that idea to the product. But 2 years of trying different approaches to the way that certain materials were used and how to join it together, and innovative types of plastic that had to be used is quite a long time. And there were definitely times when I wanted to drop the whole project and do something totally different, but sticking with it, I ended up with a unique product that is still used worldwide for recording pianos and various other things. So tenacity and motivation are really a critical factor. So I hope that helps you in a sense of just sort of rounding up some of the things that we're going to be talking about, some of the things we have talked about, and making you realize that there are many different kind of ways that creativity can be enhanced or undermined, and it's a very subtle process. For instance, if one of the previous readings who talks about loose ties and strong ties between people and others around them. Some people have a tendency to have friends and acquaintances to which they're only tied fairly loosely, or to groups that they're tied fairly loosely. In other words, those relationships are not particularly vital to their well-being. And on the other hand, other people tend to take their friends very seriously, their group membership very seriously. And the group affiliation model, you would suggest, I think you'd agree, that very strong ties will probably be counter to creativity, because this group membership is much more salient than it would be for people with loose ties. But in one of your readings, you will have discovered that there is a different way of looking at that. I don't happen to think that that way is particularly well supported, but it's there nonetheless in that reading. That would be the reading from the handbook of creativity. So anyway, that wraps it up just for the moment. Sorry that's a little bit long. I hope that's helpful though in terms of trying to pull some of the strings together, and I'll see you again soon. Thank you.